Dorothy May Caldwell had spent 68 years learning how to survive quietly. Not loudly. Not with protests or tears or raised voices in the middle of a parking lot. Quietly. With her head down and her hands always busy and her heart tucked safely behind a wall she'd built so carefully that sometimes even she forgot it was there. She had survived her husband Raymond's death at 51, leaving her alone with a half-paid mortgage and a garden full of tomatoes nobody else wanted to tend. She had survived 2 decades of working the front desk at a dental clinic, smiling at strangers through their pain, going home each evening to an empty house that echoed in ways she refused to name. She had survived the slow disappearance of friends who drifted toward grandchildren and Florida condos and the particular happiness that came from having chosen better, or at least differently, than she had. She had, she believed, survived everything life could reasonably throw at a woman. She was wrong. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate somehow. Not a Friday, which might have carried the soft mercy of a weekend to absorb the shock. Not a Monday, when you at least had the grim company of everyone else's misery. A Tuesday, the most forgettable, purposeless day of the week. The day the county informed Dorothy May Caldwell that the house she had lived in for 31 years was no longer hers to live in. She read the letter 3 times standing at her mailbox in her gardening gloves, soil still dark under her fingernails from the morning's work. The language was official and bloodless and careful in the way that legal documents always are, designed to communicate devastating things without ever acknowledging that human beings would have to read them. The house had been sold. Not by Dorothy. She hadn't sold anything. She had never wanted to sell anything. By her son. Her only son, Gerald, who was 44 years old and a regional manager for a supply chain company, and who had, it emerged in the terrible days following that letter, been named co-owner on the property deed 14 years ago when Dorothy had a health scare and had quietly, lovingly, with the innocent trust of a mother who assumed her child would always protect her, added his name to the title so that the house would transfer smoothly to him if something happened to her. Nothing had happened to her. She had recovered fully, had gardened and worked and lived and paid taxes and maintained the plumbing and painted the shutters herself on a ladder that was probably too tall for a woman her age and had done, in short, everything a person does when a house is theirs. But Gerald's name was on the deed. And Gerald, without calling her first, without visiting to talk about it over coffee, without doing her the basic human courtesy of warning her it was coming, had sold the property to a development company for $260,000, which he had deposited into an account she had no access to, and had sent her a certified letter explaining that she would need to vacate within 60 days. Vacate, as though she were a tenant, as though 31 years of her life were a lease that had simply reached its natural end. Dorothy sat down on her front step, the step she had painted herself for summers ago, the one where she kept the old blue pot of geraniums, and she held the letter in both hands, and she did not cry. She had learned over 68 years of quiet surviving that crying was something you did alone, in the dark, when no one was watching. Not on a Tuesday morning at a mailbox in a neighborhood where people walked their dogs and noticed things. She called Gerald. He answered on the 3rd ring, which told her he had seen her name on the screen and considered, briefly, not answering. She knew her son's patterns. She had made him. She knew the small calculations that happened before he did anything. "Mom," he said. Not a greeting. A preemptive defensive posture. A word that meant I know why you're calling, and I've already decided how I'm going to handle it. "Gerald," she said, "would you like to explain the letter I just received from a law firm in Charlotte?" There was a pause. The pause of a man who had rehearsed this conversation and was now finding that the rehearsed version felt less comfortable than it had in his head. "I should have told you sooner," he said. "I know that. But Mom, honestly, the house is too much for you. It's too big, it needs work, you're alone there, and the market right now is." "It's my home," Dorothy said simply. "Technically." "Gerald." Another pause. Shorter this time. "Technically, Mom, both our names are on the deed, which means legally I had the right." "I added your name," Dorothy said, and her voice was very quiet now, which in her experience was always more frightening than loudness, "so that you would be protected if something happened to me. I added your name as an act of love. And you used it to sell my house without telling me." The silence on the line was the specific silence of a person who knows, on some level, that they have done something indefensible, and has decided to defend it anyway. "It's done," Gerald said finally. "I'm sorry you're upset. Renee and I talked about it extensively, and we both feel this is really the right thing for the whole family moving forward. There are some really wonderful senior communities in the area. The facility where her aunt lives is very... A facility, Dorothy said. It's not, Mom, it's not like that. It's very independent living. You'd have your own space. Goodbye, Gerald. She hung up. She sat on her painted step beside her blue pot of geraniums, and she looked at her garden. 31 years of it. The rose bushes she'd planted the year Raymond died because she needed something to tend that couldn't leave her. The apple tree that was barely knee-high when she moved in and now stood 12 feet tall against the back fence. The herb bed, the lavender border, the old wooden bench Raymond had built for her birthday that was gray with weather but still perfectly solid because he had always built things to last. Gerald had sold all of it. Not just the house. The garden. The tree. The bench Raymond had made with his hands. Dorothy stood up, smoothed her trousers, and walked back inside to make a cup of tea and think very carefully about what came next. Because Dorothy May Caldwell did not have a grandmother with a locked basement full of hidden letters. What she had was something different. Something she had spent 40 years trying not to think about and had never, not once in all those years of quiet surviving, imagined she would ever need to use. She had been 28 years old when it happened. Young enough to be destroyed by it. Experienced enough, barely, to survive. She had been a landscape designer then, not the established, sought-after kind, but the hungry, talented, early-career kind who took any job that came and did it brilliantly and gradually built a name for herself through sheer skill and relentless effort. She had been good. Genuinely good. The kind of good that made other people notice, which was, as she later understood, the thing that had made her dangerous. The landscape architecture firm where she worked was called Harmon & Bell. Prestige firm. Old money clients. The kind of company where everything about the decor signaled that your work here would mean something, that your name attached to this firm's projects would open doors that stayed permanently shut to everyone else. Her boss had been Victor Harmon, third generation of the family that had founded the firm. 52 years old when Dorothy joined at 28. Distinguished and patrician and widely admired. The kind of man who got invited to sit on charitable boards and whose opinion on city planning matters was solicited by local government officials. A man of considerable reputation and considerable power in a mid-sized southern city where both those things mattered enormously. She had not trusted him from the beginning. There had been something in the way he looked at her during her interview. Not at her portfolio, though he'd glanced at it, but at her, a long, slow, assessing look that had made her feel like a piece of land being evaluated for its development potential. She had noticed it and then talked herself out of it, because she was 28 and needed the job, and because doubting powerful men in interview rooms was a luxury available only to people who had other options. She had worked there for 2 years, designing projects that clients loved, winning a regional award that put her name briefly in a trade publication, steadily building the kind of professional reputation that looked from the outside like a future with no ceiling. And then Victor Harmon had called her into his office on a Thursday afternoon and suggested, in the particular smooth, carefully worded way of men who are very practiced at suggesting things they want to deny later, that her continued advancement at the firm might benefit from a closer personal relationship with him. Dorothy had been very clear. She had been professional, direct, and completely unambiguous. She had told him that she was there to work, that his suggestion was inappropriate, and that she would be grateful if he did not raise the matter again. He had smiled. The kind of smile that meant you don't understand yet what you've just done. 6 weeks later, Dorothy was called into a meeting with Victor and the firm's senior partners. Men who had known Victor Harmon since their 20s, men whose professional lives were woven through with his in ways that made objectivity an architectural impossibility. And she was informed that concerns had been raised about the quality of her work, specifically that she had been misrepresenting her contributions to collaborative projects, taking credit for designs that were produced by team members while presenting them to clients as her own, behavior that they considered a fundamental violation of professional ethics. None of it was true. Not a word of it. Dorothy had the notes, the drafts, the time-stamped files, the email chains showing her work at every stage of every project attributed to her. She said this clearly. She presented her evidence calmly and precisely. It made no difference. Victor Harmon had been building his narrative for 6 weeks, had spoken to clients, had mentioned concerns in careful, reluctant tones to people who respected him, had planted seeds in the industry's soil with such practiced subtlety that by the time Dorothy sat in that meeting, the garden of her professional destruction was already half-grown. She was let go, quietly, with a severance that felt insultingly small, and a reference that was the professional equivalent of a closed door. And then the whisper campaign had started. Not loud, never loud enough to confront directly. Just whispers moving through the professional networks she'd spent 2 years carefully building. Questions about her professional ethics. Suggestions that her award-winning project had involved some irregularities in the attribution process. Hints, dropped with regretful reluctance by a deeply respected firm principal, that she might not be entirely trustworthy in collaborative environments. Her phone had stopped ringing. Interviews she'd applied for had come back with polite rejections. A contractor she'd built a close working relationship with had suddenly become unavailable. A client who'd promised to recommend her had gone mysteriously quiet. Dorothy had tried to fight it, had gone to 2 of the senior partners privately, separately, had laid out her evidence, had asked them to look at the facts rather than their loyalty to Victor, had written a formal letter to the industry association detailing what had happened. Nothing had moved. Victor Harmon had too much power, too many decades of built relationships, too much accumulated institutional trust. And Dorothy had 2 years of career history and the knowledge that she was right, which, as she was learning, was not the same thing as the ability to prove it in a way that mattered. She had left the city entirely, had gone to a smaller city, started over, retrained in related work, eventually built a modest but genuine professional life doing residential garden design for private clients who didn't know or care about the politics of a firm 300 miles away. Had met Raymond, had married him, had built a life, had kept the story locked in a room in her chest that she never opened because there was nothing in it that didn't hurt. But she had kept the evidence. Every file, every email, every timestamped draft, every document that proved irrefutably what she had contributed and when and how. Stored on an external hard drive in a fireproof box at the back of her bedroom closet, because some part of her, the stubborn, precise, detail-oriented part that had made her good at her work in the first place, had refused to let go of the proof even when proof seemed permanently useless. 40 years of evidence. Waiting. And now, Dorothy May Caldwell had 60 days to vacate the only home she still had, and nothing left to lose. And a son who had just made the catastrophic miscalculation of assuming that his quiet mother had no resources left to surprise him with. He was about to understand how wrong he was. Dorothy spent the first 3 days after Gerald's letter doing what she had always done when the world required her to fall apart. She gardened. Not the gentle leisure afternoon kind of gardening where you move slowly between beds with a cup of something warm and appreciate the light. The other kind. The kind where you attack the soil with both hands, where you pull weeds with the focused ferocity of someone who needs to destroy something and has chosen the most constructive available target. She worked from early morning until her back protested so loudly she had no choice but to stop, and then she went inside, ate something she barely tasted, and lay in the dark doing the arithmetic of her situation. The arithmetic was not encouraging. She had her savings, modest, honest savings built carefully over decades of not spending money she didn't have. Enough to rent something small for perhaps 2 years before it ran out. She had her Social Security income, which was enough to keep the lights on in a small apartment, but not enough to build anything resembling security on. She had the professional contacts she'd built through 30 years of private residential work, clients who liked her and recommended her, and paid her a fair rate for a woman doing garden design in her late 60s, but whose jobs had never been consistent enough to constitute real financial stability. She did not have a family who would help her. Gerald had made that clear without saying it directly, which was very much Gerald's communication style. His wife Renee had texted Dorothy 2 days after the phone call. Not called, texted, a careful, managing little message about how they really wanted what was best for her and how there were some beautiful communities with active social programs that she might genuinely enjoy, and how sometimes change that felt hard at first turned out to be a blessing. And wasn't it wonderful that the timing had worked out so that she'd have the summer to get settled somewhere new? Dorothy had read the text once, set her phone face down on the kitchen counter, and not responded. She had one daughter, Patricia, who was 40 years old and lived in Portland and ran a small nonprofit and had the kind of passionate, busy, intentional life that left very little room for aging mothers with complicated housing situations. Patricia called on Sunday evenings, reliably, faithfully, asking questions and listening carefully, and meaning well in every way that stopped just short of actually helping. When Dorothy had told her about the letter, Patricia had been genuinely horrified and had said several forceful things about Gerald that were accurate but impractical, and had then mentioned, apologetically, that her apartment had only one bedroom and that she was already hosting a colleague for 3 months while she sorted a visa situation. But that if Dorothy needed to, she could absolutely find a short-term rental in Portland and Patricia would help her look online. "I'm not moving to Portland," Dorothy had said, not unkindly. "No, of course not. Mom, I'm so sorry. This is genuinely awful. What are you going to do?" "I'm thinking about it," Dorothy had said. And she was. She was thinking about it with the focused precision of a woman who had once been very good at designing the kind of systems that lasted. Gardens built not for one season, but for decades, structures meant to outlive the people who planted them. She was thinking about the fireproof box in her bedroom closet. She was thinking about 40 years of evidence sitting in the dark, waiting for a season that had perhaps finally arrived. It was her neighbor Helen who brought her the newspaper. Helen was 73, a retired schoolteacher with strong opinions about bird feeders and an admirable disregard for any social convention that inconvenienced her. She had been Dorothy's neighbor for 19 years and was the closest thing Dorothy had to a best friend in the specific, unromantic way that neighboring women in their 60s and 70s become essential to each other, not through grand declarations of connection, but through the daily fabric of cups of tea borrowed and mail held during travel and the comfortable silence of two people who know each other's routines well enough to notice when something has changed. Helen had noticed. "You've been gardening like someone who received terrible news," she said, appearing at Dorothy's back gate on the 4th day with a plate of lemon cake and a copy of the regional lifestyle magazine she picked up monthly from the library. "Gerald sold the house," Dorothy said. Helen set the cake down on the garden bench and sat beside it in the way of someone settling in for a serious conversation. "Tell me everything," Dorothy told her. Not all of it, not the 40-year-old story, not the fireproof box, but the current situation, the letter, the phone call, the 60 days, the lack of anywhere obvious to go. She told it factually, without the tears that were stored in a room she still wasn't ready to open. Helen listened with the complete, still attention of a former teacher accustomed to hearing things people found difficult to say. When Dorothy finished, Helen was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up the regional magazine she'd brought and opened it to a page she'd already folded down at the corner. "Before any of that," Helen said, with the tone of someone who has been waiting to say a particular thing, "I think you should read this." Dorothy took the magazine. The article was 2 pages, accompanied by a photograph of a white-haired man in a very good suit, standing in front of a building Dorothy recognized as the Regional Arts and Commerce Center downtown. He was smiling the smile of a man who had spent decades being admired and had never found it anything less than his natural right. The headline read, "Harmon Legacy Honored. Victor Harmon to receive Lifetime Achievement Award at Annual Landscape and Design Gala. Industry pioneer and founding principal of Harmon and Bell Design Associates will be recognized for 6 decades of contribution to regional landscape architecture at this year's Meridian Design Gala, attended by industry professionals, civic leaders, and community figures from across the region." Dorothy read the article slowly, twice. Victor Harmon was 92 years old. He had retired from active practice 15 years ago, but remained, the article made clear, enormously beloved and respected within the industry. His firm had produced award-winning public spaces across the state. His mentorship of young designers was spoken of with warmth and gratitude. His philanthropic contributions to green space initiatives had been recognized by the City Council. The gala was in 3 weeks. Public event. Ticketed, but open to industry professionals and the general public alike, hosted in the main ballroom of the Arts Center, followed by a formal presentation ceremony where Victor Harmon would be given the award in front of everyone who had ever mattered to that industry. Dorothy set the magazine down. She looked at her garden. At the roses. At Raymond's bench. At 31 years of a life she was being evicted from by a son who had calculated, not entirely incorrectly, that she was alone and powerless and had no weapons left. "Well," Dorothy said, and her voice was very calm in the particular way that people who have just made a decision they are entirely committed to tend to be calm. "That changes the timeline considerably." Helen looked at her with the bright, alert expression of someone who suspects they are about to be involved in something interesting. "The box in my closet," Dorothy said. "I need to show you something." The fireproof box was gray metal, slightly dented from a move in 1998, with a 4-digit combination that Dorothy had never once forgotten. She set it on the kitchen table, turned the dial with the automatic precision of long muscle memory, and opened it. Inside, in a series of labeled manila folders held together with rubber bands that had dried and cracked with age, was 40 years of a professional life that had been stolen from her and the evidence that proved it. She had been methodical about keeping it, even when keeping it had seemed like the habit of someone who couldn't let go of something that no longer mattered. Every email she had sent and received during her 2 years at Harman and Bell, printed and filed in chronological order. Every design draft with her handwritten notes in the margins. Every client communication. Every time-stamped digital file, transferred across 4 different hard drives over 40 years as technology changed, preserved with the stubborn care of a woman who had never quite decided it was safe to destroy the proof. But the most important pieces were not the digital files. They were 3 letters. The first was from a woman named Constance Webb, who had been a junior designer at Harman and Bell at the same time as Dorothy, a nervous, quiet woman 3 years younger, who had watched what happened to Dorothy and said nothing publicly, but had sent a letter to Dorothy's home address 8 months later, when Dorothy had already left the city, full of agonized guilt and detailed, specific, witnessed account of what she had seen. The closed-door meeting where she had heard Victor Harman dictating his version of events to a senior partner, the conversation she'd overheard in the hallway where he'd discussed which clients to contact and what to imply. The project files she had personally seen Dorothy working late on that Victor had later claimed were produced primarily by other team members. I was too afraid of what he could do to my career to say any of this publicly, Constance had written. I had student loans and no savings, and I watched what he did to you in 6 weeks, and I was simply terrified. I have been ashamed of my silence every day since. I don't know if this letter helps you. I hope it helps you somehow. You were the best designer in that office, and everyone knew it. And what he did to you was deliberate and cruel, and I am sorry I was too much of a coward to stop it. The second letter was from a man named Arthur Finley, who had been one of the firm's primary contractors during the period Dorothy worked there. An older man, practical and direct, who had seen enough of how the firm operated to understand exactly what had happened. His letter, written 2 years after Dorothy left and addressed to her through a mutual contact, was shorter and angrier than Constance's, with the plain-spoken certainty of someone who had decided that shame was less important than honesty and had simply written down what he'd observed. The projects Dorothy had designed. The client meetings he'd attended where her work was presented by Victor as collaborative when Arthur had seen the drafts and knew whose hand was behind them. The deliberate, systematic erasure of her contributions from the firm's narrative once Victor had decided she needed to be removed. I kept copies of the project documentation from that period. Arthur had written. The original site plans Dorothy Caldwell produced for the Meridian Waterfront Project and the East Side Community Gardens are in her handwriting, with her project number stamps. I kept them because something told me they might matter one day. They are available if you ever need them. Dorothy had written back. Arthur had sent her the copies. They were in the box. The third document was different from the letters. It was an internal Harman and Bell memorandum. How Dorothy had obtained it was a story that involved a former firm administrator named Grace, who had quietly retired 6 months after Dorothy's dismissal and had felt, in retirement, that her conscience needed clearing. The memo was from Victor Harman to the senior partners, dated 4 days after Dorothy had refused him in his office. It outlined, in the clipped, strategic language of a man who considered himself permanently above consequence, a plan for managing her departure from the firm in a way that would prevent her from pursuing legal action and damage her professional reputation sufficiently that she would not be in a position to challenge the firm's account of events. It did not say explicitly, "I am doing this because she rejected me." Men like Victor Harman never wrote that down. But it was written 4 days after she'd refused him, and it detailed her professional destruction with the calm specificity of someone who had made a very deliberate decision. Dorothy had shown this memo to a lawyer once long ago. The lawyer had told her that while it was suggestive, it was not conclusively actionable, that without a pattern of similar behavior toward other women, without willing witnesses, without the institutional willingness to take on a firm of Harman and Bell's standing, the likelihood of a successful legal claim was low. The reputational damage to Dorothy during the process of trying would likely exceed whatever outcome she might achieve. She had put the memo back in the box. She had built a life anyway. But now Victor Harman was about to stand in front of the entire regional industry to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award. And Dorothy had 3 weeks and a fireproof box and absolutely nothing left to lose. She laid all 3 documents on her kitchen table and looked at them for a long moment. Then she looked at Helen, who had been reading over her shoulder with the focused attention of a woman who had spent 30 years teaching children to understand evidence. "Dorothy," Helen said quietly, and her voice had the particular weight of someone choosing words carefully because the moment requires it. "What are you going to do?" Dorothy thought about Gerald's text about senior communities with active social programs. She thought about Renee's managing little message about blessings and timing. She thought about the garden bench Raymond had built to last, that would be destroyed by a development company in 60 days if she did nothing. "I'm going to that gala," Dorothy said. Dorothy did not rush. That was the first decision she made, and in many ways it was the most important one. She had watched enough things go wrong in her life to understand that desperation produced mistakes, and mistakes in a situation like this one would not just fail. They would confirm every narrative that powerful people preferred about difficult women who made accusations. Too emotional, too erratic, too consumed by old grievances to be trusted with serious attention. She would not be any of those things. She would be precise. She would be documented. She would be, when the moment came, completely and irrefutably correct. She gave herself the first week entirely for preparation. Not for action, for preparation. There was a difference, and honoring that difference was what separated people who fought effectively from people who simply fought loudly. She began with the files. She spread everything from the fireproof box across her kitchen table and organized it with the systematic care she had once applied to complex planting plans. Chronologically, thematically, cross-referenced and indexed, so that any claim she made could be supported within seconds by the exact document that proved it. She made 2 complete copies of everything, storing one set in a separate bag that never left her possession, mailing the second set to Patricia in Portland with a letter explaining what it was and asking her to keep it safe without asking questions yet. Patricia called the same evening the package arrived. "Mom, what is all of this?" "Insurance," Dorothy said. "I'll explain when the time is right. For now I just need to know it exists somewhere that isn't my house, which I won't have for much longer." A silence, the kind that meant Patricia was doing the careful arithmetic of how much to push and deciding against it. "Okay," she said finally. "It's safe. I've got it. Thank you, sweetheart." "Mom." "Yes. Whatever you're planning, be careful." "Not safe. Careful. There's a difference." Dorothy smiled at the phone. "I know the difference," she said. "I've known it for a long time." The second thing she did was find Constance Webb. It was not difficult. Constance had built a genuine career after Harmon and Bell, had eventually found her footing at a smaller firm in a different city, had gone back for an advanced degree in her 40s, had spent the last 15 years as a professor of landscape architecture at a state university 2 hours away. Her faculty profile was publicly available on the university website, with a professional photograph and an office email address. Dorothy sat in front of her laptop for a long time before writing the email. She had thought about this possibility before, in the years since Constance's letter had arrived, had imagined, occasionally, what it might look like to use what Constance had witnessed, to make it matter in some public way. She had always dismissed the thought because the timing had never been right, and the professional cost to Constance would have been real, and Dorothy had never wanted to pull someone else into her wound if there was nothing useful to be gained from it. Now there was something useful to be gained. She wrote the email plainly and honestly, without drama or emotional pressure, explaining who she was, reminding Constance of the letter she'd sent 40 years ago, describing the situation with the gala and the award and what Dorothy was planning to do, and asking simply whether Constance would be willing to speak. Not necessarily publicly, not immediately, but whether she would be willing to confirm, in whatever form felt manageable to her, what she had witnessed. She sent it on a Wednesday evening and told herself firmly that she would not check for a response before the following morning. She checked twice before midnight. The response came at 7 the next morning, and Dorothy read it standing in her kitchen in her dressing gown with her first cup of tea, and had to set the cup down because her hands were suddenly not entirely reliable. "Dorothy," Constance had written, "I have thought about you more times over the past 40 years than I can count. I have thought about that letter I sent you, which felt so inadequate then and more inadequate with every passing year. I have built an entire career in an industry where Victor Harmon is considered a legend, and I have had to sit through more than one event where his name was spoken with reverence by people who have no idea what I know about him. I have been waiting, without fully admitting it to myself, for someone to give me a reason to finally say what I know. I am 68 years old. I am a tenured professor. He cannot touch my career anymore. Yes, I will speak. Tell me what you need and when you need it. Dorothy read the email twice, then a third time. Then she did something she had not done in a very long time. She sat down at her kitchen table, put her face in her hands, and cried. Not the grief kind. The other kind, the sudden, overwhelming release of a tension you have been holding for so long that you had forgotten it was separate from your normal state of being. The kind that meant something you had carried alone was no longer, for the first time in 40 years, entirely yours to carry alone. She gave herself 10 minutes. Then she washed her face, refilled her tea, and went back to work. Arthur Findlay was gone. She had suspected this might be the case. He had been in his late 50s when he wrote his letter, which would make him nearly 100 now, and she had prepared herself for the possibility. She found his obituary with a single careful search. Arthur James Findlay, contractor and craftsman, had died 11 years ago at 81, survived by his wife Margaret and his daughter Suzanne. Dorothy sat with this for a moment. Then she searched for Suzanne Findlay. It took 2 days and a trail of professional directories and social media pages that Helen helped navigate because Helen's grandchildren had taught her things about online searching that Dorothy found bewildering and Helen found delightfully practical. Suzanne Findlay was 54, ran a small construction management firm in a city 40 miles away, and had her business email listed publicly on her company website. Dorothy wrote to her. She was honest about who she was and what she was looking for, honest about her uncertainty. She explained that her father had written to her 40 years ago about having copies of project documentation, and that she did not know whether those copies still existed, that she understood completely if they had been lost in the decades since, that she was not asking Suzanne to take on anything that felt like her responsibility to carry. Suzanne responded in 24 hours. I know exactly what you're talking about, she wrote, with the direct efficiency of someone accustomed to managing complicated things. My father kept everything. He kept it specifically because he said one day someone was going to need it. He told me about you. He told me about the firm and what happened. He made me promise to keep the files in case you, or someone like you ever came looking. I thought it was a bit dramatic, honestly, the way he talked about it. I understand now that it wasn't. The files are in a storage unit I maintain with his papers. I can have copies to you by the end of this week. Dorothy had to put the laptop down again. Arthur Findlay had held the evidence for 4 decades because something in him had refused to believe that truth had a disposal date. A man she had known briefly and professionally, a contractor who owed her nothing and had nothing to gain from keeping her story safe, had held it anyway, had passed the obligation to his daughter like an inheritance, had trusted that the day would eventually come when it would matter. She thought of him, this man she barely remembered, and felt something she could only call gratitude so deep it had no bottom. Mr. Findlay, she said quietly, to no one in particular. Thank you. The phone call came on the 8th day of her preparation, and it was the one she had not planned for. She was in the garden, working the soil around the base of the apple tree in the methodical way of someone saying goodbye to something slowly enough to make the goodbye bearable, when her mobile rang with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She had been fielding calls from a realtor Gerald had apparently hired to help her find a new place. Calls she had been responding to with a politeness she did not feel, and she was tired of being managed by people who thought her problem was logistical rather than human. But something made her answer. Is this Dorothy Caldwell? A woman's voice. Older. Careful. It is, Dorothy said. My name is Irene Marsh. You won't know me. I'm calling because I need to explain how I got your number, and I need to ask you to hear me out before you decide I'm a nuisance. All right, Dorothy said slowly. I'm 80 years old, Irene said. I was a landscape architect. I practiced for 30 years, mostly in the private residential sector. I retired 12 years ago. I never worked for Harman and Bell. But Victor Harman, a pause. The specific pause of someone choosing, after a long time, to finally say something. Victor Harman did to me in 1979 what I believe he did to you in the early 1980s. I was 26 years old. I was a junior designer working on a civic project where he was the lead consultant. I rejected him, and he spent the next 3 years systematically dismantling every professional relationship I had built in this region. I eventually moved away and rebuilt elsewhere. I have spent 50 years watching him accumulate honors, and I have said nothing because I believed my word against his alone was worthless. Dorothy stood very still in her garden. How did you find me? She asked. Constance Webb called me, Irene said. She and I have known each other professionally for 20 years. When you contacted her, she thought of me. She asked if I would be willing to speak to you. I told her I needed to think about it. Another pause. I have thought about it. I am 80 years old, and I have watched that man be celebrated for 6 decades, and I have kept quiet because I thought it would cost me more than I could afford. I cannot afford anything anymore in the way you mean when you're young and trying to protect a career. What I can afford now, the only thing I have left that still feels like it matters, is the truth. If you're going to that gala, Dorothy, I would like to come with you. Dorothy looked at the apple tree. At the roses. At Raymond's bench going gray and beautiful in the afternoon light. She thought about being 28 years old and sitting in that meeting while Victor Harmon's carefully cultivated narrative dismantled her future with the efficient precision of a garden being paved over. She thought about Constance, who had been afraid and sent a letter and carried guilt for 4 decades. About Arthur Finley, who had kept copies because something in him refused to let truth have an expiration date. About Irene Marsh, who was 80 years old and had decided that the only thing she had left to spend was honesty. Yes, Dorothy said. I would like that very much. The week before the gala, Dorothy made one more call. To Gerald. Not because she wanted to. Not because she had softened toward what he had done or felt any pull toward reconciliation that hadn't been earned. But because she was, at her core, a woman who believed in the dignity of warning. She would not do to her son what had been done to her. She would not act without giving him the chance to understand, first, what was coming. Gerald, she said when he answered with the same wary, prepared for difficulty tone he'd been using since the letter. I'm calling to tell you something. Not to ask anything of you. Just to tell you. Mom, if this is about the house again. It's not about the house. The house is already gone and we both know it. She kept her voice even and clear. Before you were born, before your father and I met, I worked for a firm called Harmon and Bell. I was very good at my work, and the man who ran the firm tried to use his power over me in a way I refused to accept. So, he destroyed my professional reputation. I spent 40 years living with the consequences of that. I kept the evidence because I am the kind of person who keeps things carefully. A silence on the line. Gerald listening differently now. Not defensively, but with the particular quality of attention someone gives to a story they sense is important. Next week, Dorothy continued, that man is being given a Lifetime Achievement Award at a public ceremony. I am attending that ceremony. I am bringing documented evidence and 2 witnesses. I am going to make sure the truth about what he did is heard by the people who have spent 6 decades honoring him. I thought you should know. Not because I need your support. I stopped waiting for that. But because you are my son, and despite everything, I believe in the basic dignity of letting people know what's happening in each other's lives. The silence stretched. Mom, Gerald said finally, and his voice had lost the managed, efficient quality entirely. He sounded, for the first time in years, genuinely uncertain. Why didn't you ever tell us about this? Because, Dorothy said, I spent your entire childhood trying to protect you from the hardest parts of my history. I wanted you to have a mother who seemed capable and strong, rather than someone who had been broken by things she couldn't control. I wanted you to be proud of me. A pause. I understand the irony of that, given recent events. Mom, I'm not calling for an apology, Gerald. I'll be in touch after the gala. She hung up and stood for a moment in the kitchen that would not be hers in 3 weeks, and breathed slowly, and let herself feel the particular quiet that comes after you have said something true that you have been holding in your body for a very long time. Then she went to her bedroom, opened her closet, and began selecting what to wear. Dorothy had not owned anything formal in 11 years. The last occasion that had required it had been Raymond's retirement dinner, a gentle evening at a restaurant downtown where she had worn a deep green dress she'd bought on sale and felt, for the entirety of that night, quietly and completely happy. She had donated the dress 3 years after Raymond died, in one of those practical grief management purges where you remove the objects most saturated with specific happiness, because living alongside them every day is a particular kind of pain. She did not regret donating it. She just needed something else now. Helen drove her to a consignment shop on the other side of town, one of those unhurried, generous places with good lighting and organized racks, and the particular democracy of excellent things that had outlasted the circumstances that originally produced them. Dorothy moved through the formal section slowly and without anxiety, which surprised her. She had expected to feel the pressure of the occasion in the way she usually felt pressure, as a tightening in the chest, a speeding of thought. Instead, she felt unusually calm. The calm of someone who has already made the hardest decision and is now simply executing it. She found it 40 minutes in. A charcoal gray dress, silk blend, structured through the shoulders and bodice in a way that communicated authority without effort, falling to a length that was elegant and practical in equal measure. It had been worn once, clearly, and cared for meticulously afterward. The kind of garment that had been made by someone who understood that good clothes were not decoration but architecture. They created the space within which a person could be taken seriously. She tried it on and stood in front of the fitting room mirror for a long moment. She looked like someone who had something important to say. "That's the one," Helen said from outside the curtain, without even being asked. Dorothy looked at herself one more time. At the white hair she wore short and without apology, at the face that 68 years had written on honestly, at the dress that sat on her shoulders like something that had been waiting for her specifically. "Yes," she agreed. "That's the one." She drove herself to the gala. Constance Webb had offered to pick her up. They had spoken by phone 3 times in the preceding week, finding in each other the particular ease of two women who had been shaped by the same formative injustice and had spent decades processing it separately and now could finally speak of it directly. Constance was warm and funny and angrier than Dorothy in the specific way of someone who had never quite made their peace with staying quiet, and Dorothy had found her company surprisingly restorative. But she wanted to arrive alone. To park her own car, walk in through her own entrance, take her own seat. She wanted the mechanics of getting there to be entirely hers, so that what happened inside would feel entirely hers as well. She had bought one ticket. General admission, $55, processed through the Arts Center's public website on a Tuesday morning like anyone else's transaction. She had her name on no special list. No one at the gala knew she was coming, except Constance and Irene, who had bought their own tickets separately and agreed to be seated at different tables through the dinner portion. Visible to Dorothy from across the room, present as confirmed witnesses and willing speakers, but allowing Dorothy the initial moment to be what it needed to be. Hers. The Arts Center was everything the regional lifestyle magazine had made it look. A restored 1930s building with high ceilings and warm lighting, and the specific grandeur that comes from a structure that has seen enough history to have stopped trying to impress anyone. The ballroom held perhaps 200 people, round tables draped in ivory linen, a long head table at the front where the evening's honorees and dignitaries would sit, a low stage with a lectern and a microphone, and an enormous floral arrangement that someone had spent a professional amount of time and money assembling. Dorothy checked in at the registration desk, collected her table card, and moved into the room with the measured pace of someone entirely comfortable in a space where they were entirely unknown. She found her table, a round of 8 near the center of the room, already occupied by 4 people who introduced themselves with the cheerful efficiency of industry professionals accustomed to networking dinners. A landscape architect from the eastern part of the state, 2 urban planners from the city government, a young woman who was completing her graduate thesis on green infrastructure and had bought her ticket specifically to see Victor Harmon honored, whose work she had studied and admired. Dorothy listened to this last piece of information with the particular stillness of someone receiving a small additional weight and deciding, without drama, to carry it. She ordered water. She looked at the menu. She watched the room fill. Victor Harmon arrived at 7:20, escorted by a man Dorothy recognized from the article as the current director of his former firm. A man in his 50s who had presumably built his career within the institution Harmon had created and whose respect for the old man appeared genuine and unreserved. Harmon moved slowly, with a cane, but held his head with the particular erectness of someone who had spent a lifetime understanding the communicative power of posture. He was introduced at the head table to a warm, rolling wave of applause that moved through the room with the ease of affection people had been carrying for a long time and were glad to finally express. Dorothy watched him accept the attention with gracious, practiced modesty. The slight bow, the hand placed briefly over the heart, the smile that managed to suggest both humility and the absolute quiet confidence of a man who had never once seriously doubted his own standing. She thought about the memo in her bag. She kept her hands in her lap and her face composed, and she ate her dinner. Across the room, she could see Constance at a table near the windows, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair, somewhere between composed and coiled, like someone who has decided to do something frightening and is managing the interval before it by sheer discipline. Their eyes met once during the salad course, and Constance gave her a small nod that meant "I'm here." I'm ready. 2 tables beyond Constance, Irene Marsh sat with the stillness of a woman who had spent 80 years becoming comfortable with difficult silences. She was smaller than Dorothy had imagined from her voice, compact and precise, with the particular dignity of someone who had stopped performing youth a long time ago and had found the alternative considerably more comfortable. She did not look toward Dorothy during dinner. She ate and listened to her tablemates and waited with the patience of someone who had been waiting for 50 years and could manage another hour. The dinner concluded. The coffee came. The program began. There were 3 speakers before the main presentation. A city council member who spoke warmly about Harmon's contributions to public green space, a former client who told an anecdote about a garden that had become the center of his family's life for 3 decades, a young designer who spoke movingly about finding Harmon's early work in an architecture library and feeling, for the first time, that landscape design could be genuinely meaningful. Dorothy listened to all of it. She listened without interrupting the warmth in the room, without letting her private knowledge curdle into contempt for people who had been allowed to see only one side of a man who had carefully managed which sides were visible. She was not angry at the speakers. They were telling the truth as they knew it. The problem was not that they were lying. The problem was that they had never been given the chance to know the whole truth. She was about to give them that chance. The gala director, a woman in her 40s named Carol Bridges, who had the organized, good-humored energy of someone who had run many of these events and genuinely enjoyed them, moved to the lectern for the formal presentation. Victor Harmon, she began, has been a part of this industry's landscape, literally and figuratively, for 60 years. His firm produced work that shaped the physical experience of our region in ways most people encounter daily without knowing his name is attached to them. His mentorship touched hundreds of careers. His advocacy for public green spaces changed the policy conversation in this city in ways that still resonate today. It is my honor to. Excuse me. Dorothy's voice was clear and unhurried, and entirely without apology. The room shifted. Not a gasp, just the subtle, collective reorientation of 200 people turning toward an unexpected sound. Dorothy stood. She had planned this moment with the same careful attention she had once given to the placement of every element in a garden design. Where to stand, how to hold herself, what to say first and what to say second, and what words to use for each piece, and in what order. She had rehearsed it sitting on Raymond's bench in the garden at dusk, alone, speaking to the roses, until the words came in the right order without effort. The way a song comes when you have sung it often enough that the singing is less an act than a memory your body carries. My name is Dorothy May Caldwell, she said. I was a landscape architect for 35 years. I am 68 years old. And I have something to say before this award is presented that I believe the people in this room deserve to hear. Carol Bridges at the lectern looked at her with the expression of someone rapidly assessing whether this was a planned part of the program she hadn't been briefed on, or something else entirely. Ma'am, this isn't. I know it isn't, Dorothy said, not unkindly. I am asking for 3 minutes. What I have to say is documented. It is evidenced. And it directly concerns the professional character of the man you are about to honor. She paused. 3 minutes. Then you can make whatever decision you feel is right. The room was very quiet. At the head table, Victor Harmon had not moved. He was looking at Dorothy with the particular controlled stillness of a man who has just recognized a threat and is calculating his response. His face had not changed dramatically. Men like Victor Harmon did not dramatically change their faces in public. But something in his eyes had shifted in the fraction of a second before he controlled it, and Dorothy had seen it, and it told her everything she needed to know about what he remembered and what he feared. Carol Bridges looked at her for a long moment. Then she stepped back from the lectern and gestured, briefly, toward the microphone. Dorothy walked to the front of the room. She set her bag on the edge of the stage and removed 3 documents: the memo, the copy of Constance's letter, the copy of Arthur Finley's letter, and laid them on the lectern where she could refer to them if needed. She did not pick them up. She knew what was in them. She had known for 40 years. She looked out at 200 faces and spoke clearly and without rushing. In 1983, I was 28 years old and worked as a junior designer at Harmon & Bell. I was good at my work. I won an industry award. My projects were well received by clients. I was, by any measurable standard, building a career that had a genuine future. She let that sit for a moment. Victor Harmon called me into his office and made a suggestion that was not professional. I said no, clearly, directly, and without ambiguity. For days later, She touched the memo without lifting it. He began the systematic process of destroying my professional reputation. He told senior partners I was misrepresenting my contributions to projects. He contacted clients and implied irregularities. He used 40 years of accumulated relationships and institutional trust to ensure that my word, when I tried to present my evidence, counted for nothing against his. She looked at Victor Harmon. He was looking back at her. His hands were flat on the table. He was very still. I have here a memorandum from Victor Harmon to his senior partners, dated 4 days after I declined his suggestion. It outlines, in his own words, a strategy for managing my departure and limiting my professional options. I have a letter from a colleague who was present at the firm during this period and witnessed specific events I have described. I have documentation from the project contractor who worked alongside me on multiple projects and retained original site plans bearing my name and project stamps. Plans that were later attributed in the firm's public record to collaborative teams rather than to me specifically. She paused and let the room absorb this. I left the region. I rebuilt my career elsewhere. I said nothing for 40 years because I believed, not without reason, that I had no power against him. Because I had tried the appropriate channels and they had protected him rather than the truth. Because I calculated, as young women in professional situations calculate, that speaking would cost me more than silence. Her voice was completely steady. She had spent 40 years becoming this steady, and the steadiness was real. Not performed, not constructed for the room, but genuinely hers, the product of every hard morning she had gotten up and kept building a life anyway. I am 68 years old now. I have nothing professionally to lose and nothing personally to protect. My home has been taken from me by my own son. And so I am standing here tonight with nothing remaining to hold me back from saying plainly what I have known for 4 decades. She looked at the room, at the city council member, at the young graduate student who had bought her ticket to honor the man whose work she admired, at the faces of 200 people who had come to celebrate a legacy and were now being asked to look at it completely. Victor Harmon is not the man this award describes. He is a man who used his power to pursue women who worked under his influence, and who destroyed those who refused him. I am not the only one. I am simply the one who kept the documents and waited long enough to use them. She reached down and picked up a small remote she had borrowed from Helen's grandson, who had helped her assemble the last piece of her preparation over the previous 3 days. A screen that Dorothy had quietly arranged with the venue's AV technician that afternoon. She had arrived 3 hours early, explaining she had a brief visual component to a personal tribute she was planning, which was not technically inaccurate, lit up on the wall behind the stage. On it, side by side, were 2 things. The first was the original site plan for the Meridian Waterfront project, photographed from Arthur Finley's copies. In the lower right corner, in Dorothy's precise handwriting, was her name, her project number, her date stamp. The plan that had been publicly attributed to a team effort at a firm where she had been erased. The second was a photograph of the same project as it appeared in Harmon and Bell's official portfolio, with a design credit that did not include her name. The room was completely silent. Dorothy turned to the screen, looked at it for 1 moment, then looked back at the room. "My name should be there," she said simply. "It was there once. Someone decided it shouldn't be." She stepped back from the lectern. She had not planned to say more than this. She had planned to present the evidence, to be clear and factual and completely controlled, to let the truth speak without performing more emotion than it needed. But something happened then that she had not planned for. Constance Webb stood up. She stood at her table near the windows, in the middle of the silent room, and she said in a voice that was clear and entirely certain, "My name is Constance Webb. I am a professor of landscape architecture at Millbrook State University. I worked at Harmon and Bell in 1983. I witnessed the events Dorothy Caldwell has described. I wrote a letter confirming this 40 years ago, and I was too afraid of this man's power to say it publicly. I am not afraid anymore." And then Irene Marsh stood up. "My name is Irene Marsh. I am 80 years old and a retired landscape architect. Victor Harmon attempted in 1979 what he apparently attempted with Dorothy Caldwell in 1983. I said nothing for 50 years because I believed no one would listen. I am saying it now." The silence in the room was the particular silence that descends when a narrative that has been stable for decades suddenly, irrevocably shifts. Dorothy could feel it. Not just hear it, but feel it in the quality of the air, the way every person in the room was recalibrating something they had come in believing. Victor Harmon had still not moved. His hands were still flat on the table. His face was controlled. But his eyes, when Dorothy looked at him for the last time that evening, were the eyes of a man watching something he had built over 60 years come apart with the slow, unstoppable certainty of a structure whose foundation had always been less solid than it appeared. Carol Bridges stood at the side of the stage, the award plaque in her hands, looking at it with an expression Dorothy recognized. The expression of someone who has just understood that the next decision they make will define considerably more than this evening. She set the plaque carefully, face down on the table beside her. Dorothy picked up her documents from the lectern, placed them back in her bag with steady hands, stepped down from the stage, and walked back through the silent, watching room to collect her coat. She had said what needed saying. Now the room would decide what to do with it. Dorothy drove home alone through streets that were quiet and dark and completely indifferent to what had just happened to her. She had expected to feel triumphant. She had prepared herself, during the weeks of planning, for the possibility that she would feel nothing, that the moment would be too large or too long delayed to produce the clean, uncomplicated satisfaction she had imagined 40 years ago when she had first understood fully what had been done to her. She had told herself that justice arriving late was still justice, but that late arrival changed its texture, made it more complicated and bittersweet than the straightforward vindication she had once wanted so badly she could taste it. What she had not prepared for was what she actually felt, which was something quieter and stranger and more personal than either triumph or emptiness. She felt, driving through those dark streets with her bag of documents on the passenger seat and the charcoal gray dress still on her shoulders, like herself. Not a wronged version of herself. Not a surviving version. Not the version that had been careful and quiet and had tucked her wound behind a wall for 4 decades because there was no other practical option. Just herself, Dorothy May Caldwell, 68 years old, landscape architect, gardener, Raymond's wife, Gerald's mother, Patricia's mother, a woman who had been good at her work and had known it even when she'd been the only one saying so. She had not felt simply like herself in a very long time. She sat in her driveway for several minutes after she parked, not ready yet to go inside, just sitting in the dark with that feeling, holding it carefully the way you hold something you understand is temporary and want to honor before it changes into the next thing. Then she went inside, made tea, and waited for the world to respond. It did not take long. By midnight, someone at the gala had posted a video on social media. Not Dorothy's full statement, a fragment, perhaps 90 seconds, showing her at the lectern with the 2 site plans side by side on the screen behind her, her voice clear and unhurried, saying my name should be there. It was there once. Someone decided it shouldn't be. By morning it had been shared 11,000 times. By the following afternoon, 200,000. The comments were, as social media comments tended to be, a mixture of genuine human response and reflexive argument, and people who had never experienced injustice professionally, but had opinions about it regardless. Dorothy read some of them, then stopped, because the comments were not the point and never had been. The point was the room. The point was the 200 people who had been present and who had looked at the screen and at Victor Harmon and at Constance standing and Irene standing, and had recalibrated something they had come in believing. The point was what happened in the room. The Regional Landscape Architecture Association issued a statement by the following morning. Measured, carefully worded in the way of organizations that have legal departments, but unambiguous in its core meaning. It stated that the association was aware of the serious concerns raised at the previous evening's event, that it was undertaking an immediate review of the circumstances surrounding the award, that the award presentation was being postponed pending that review, and that the association was committed to a process that took all credible evidence seriously and produced an outcome consistent with the profession's values. The award had not been given. Carol Bridges called Dorothy on Friday morning, personally, from her mobile number. She was direct and without the defensive organizational language of her association's written statement. I owe you an apology, she said. Not on behalf of the association. Personally, I have been aware of Victor Harmon's reputation in certain respects for years. Rumors that I told myself were rumors rather than patterns. I had the choice for this award to look more carefully. I didn't make that choice. You made it for me, and I am ashamed it took your courage rather than mine to get here. Dorothy listened to this with care. I appreciate that, she said finally. I know it isn't easy to say. What can we do? Carol asked. Concretely, what does the association owe you? Dorothy had thought about this. She had thought about it specifically and practically, in the way she thought about all things that required design. Not what would feel satisfying in a single dramatic moment, but what would last, what would change the landscape in ways that mattered beyond the immediate. A public correction of the project records, she said. Not a statement that says mistakes were made in a passive way that doesn't name anyone. A specific, named correction that attributes the Meridian Waterfront Project and the East Side Community Gardens accurately, with my name restored to the professional record. That work was mine. I want my name on it. Yes, Carol said immediately. And a formal review process for the award itself that includes speaking to Constance Webb and Irene Marsh, whose accounts were witnessed and documented and deserve to be part of whatever the association's official record of this becomes. Yes. And, Dorothy said, I would like the young woman who was at my table at the gala, the graduate student writing her thesis on Victor Harmon's work. I would like someone to contact her and offer her access to the corrected project records before she submits. She deserves to work from the complete truth, not the curated version. There was a brief silence on the line. That, Carol said quietly, is a remarkably generous thing to ask for. She reminded me of myself at 26, Dorothy said simply. I would have given a great deal to have had someone do that for me. Victor Harmon did not call. She had not expected him to. Men who had spent 60 years being Victor Harmon did not call women they had wronged to offer personal accountability. What he did, through his lawyer, was issue a statement that was the written equivalent of a man stepping carefully backward while maintaining eye contact, expressing regret for any professional harm that may have occurred, acknowledging that the culture of the industry during that period had not always supported all voices equally, expressing a desire for healing and forward movement. It did not say he had done what he had done. It said, in the careful language of managed liability, that things had happened and that he was sorry about the happening of them in a general way that declined to specify his role in their occurrence. Dorothy read it once, then set it aside. She had not done what she had done for his apology. She had stopped needing his apology somewhere in the second decade of carrying the wound, when she had understood that the only apology worth waiting for was the kind that actually arrived, and that waiting for one from a man like Victor Harmon was a way of staying in his power long after the direct damage was done. She had made her peace, years ago, with the likelihood that she would never hear him say directly what he had done. What she had wanted was the record corrected, her name restored to the work she had made. That was happening. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than she had allowed herself to believe she would ever have, and sitting with its reality required a kind of internal adjustment she found unexpectedly moving. The recalibration of a person who has defended themselves against hope for so long that hope, when it actually arrives, initially feels like something to be suspicious of. Gerald came on Saturday morning. Not a text this time. Not a managed phone call. He drove 2 hours and appeared on her doorstep at 9 in the morning with the expression of a man who has done something he cannot undo and has spent the intervening time understanding it more fully with each passing hour. She let him in. He sat at her kitchen table, in the kitchen that had been hers for 31 years and had 24 days left of being hers, and he looked around the room with the face of someone seeing a place he has failed to adequately value until the moment it became obvious he was going to lose it. Mom, he started. Gerald, I watched the video, he said. I watched all of it. Constance standing up, and that other woman standing up, and... He stopped. Started again. I didn't know any of that had happened to you. I didn't know any of it existed. No, Dorothy agreed. You didn't. Why didn't you ever tell us? I told you on the phone, Dorothy said. I wanted you to have a mother who seemed capable. She looked at him with the direct, unsentimental clarity of a woman who had spent the previous 2 weeks stripping away everything that wasn't essential. And I think, if I'm honest, I was also ashamed. Not of what happened, of how long it took me to do anything about it. Shame is very good at making people stay quiet, Gerald. That's what makes it useful to the people who deploy it. He was quiet for a moment. The house, he said finally. I know I can't undo it. The contract is signed, the sale is closed, I can't legally reverse it. But I have the money from the sale. I have $260,000 that... He stopped, recalibrated. That belongs to you. All of it. I want to transfer it to you entirely. Whatever you decide to do with it. Dorothy looked at her son. This 44-year-old man she had made and raised and loved through his worst and least admirable moments, who had done something genuinely terrible and was sitting in her kitchen trying to find the shape of accountability that was proportionate to it. Why? She said. Because it's yours, he said. Because I took something that wasn't mine to take, and I used it as though your life was a financial asset I had the right to liquidate. Because I watched you stand in that room and say things that should have broken you, and you were. Mom, you were so. His voice gave way briefly. He steadied it. I was proud of you. I was proud of you and ashamed of myself at the same time. And I don't know how those two things live in the same chest, but they do. Dorothy looked at him for a long time. I'll accept the money, she said. Not as forgiveness. Not as payment for forgiveness. As the correction of a wrong, which is what it is. Corrections are not the same as reconciliation. I know, Gerald said quietly. I know they're not. Reconciliation, Dorothy continued, is something that happens over time, through consistent behavior, if you choose to pursue it. It is not guaranteed. It is earned, if it comes at all. I understand, he said. Good. She stood, moved to the kettle. Do you want tea? He blinked, surprised by the ordinariness of it. Yes, he said. Please. She made tea. They sat together at the kitchen table in the house that had 24 days left of being hers, and they talked, not about the wound, which had been named and would need years to scar over properly, but about small things, adjacent things, the kind of conversation that is really a tentative first step on a road whose destination neither person can see yet, but both are willing to try walking. It was not resolution. It was not the movie's version of a son understanding his mistake and a mother forgiving him, and everything being healed in a single meaningful conversation. It was something more honest than that. It was a beginning of the kind that is only possible after a full reckoning with what needs to begin again. Patricia arrived on Sunday. She had booked a flight the morning after the video circulated without calling first, which was very much Patricia's way of handling things she cared about. Action first, conversation on arrival. She appeared at the door with a rolling suitcase, and the expression of a woman who has been holding a significant amount of emotion at a careful distance for several days, and has decided that distance is no longer sustainable. She walked in, looked at her mother standing in the kitchen doorway in her gardening clothes, and said nothing at all for a moment. Then she crossed the kitchen in 4 quick steps and put her arms around Dorothy with the full, unguarded force of a person who has been frightened and is now relieved and is not managing either feeling. Dorothy held her daughter. She held her for a long time, in the kitchen of the house that was leaving, and let herself be held back, and felt the specific weight of being someone's mother. The complicated, imperfect, irreplaceable weight of it. You should have told us, Patricia said into her shoulder. About all of it. The firm, what happened, the box, all of it. I know, Dorothy said. I was protecting you. I didn't need protecting, Patricia said. I needed to know who my mother actually was. Dorothy pulled back and looked at her daughter's face. The face that had some of Raymond in it, around the eyes, in a way that still occasionally startled her. You know now, she said. Yes, Patricia said. I do. On the last day before she had to leave the house, Dorothy went into the garden at dawn. The light came in the particular way it did in early morning, sideways and golden, touching everything at an angle that made familiar things look newly considered, like objects in a painting that have been waiting their whole existence for exactly this quality of light to reveal them properly. The roses were in the middle of their spring flush, generous and slightly overblown in the way of roses at their peak, not careful or restrained but fully and completely themselves. The apple tree cast its long shadow across the lawn in the direction it had always cast it. Raymond's bench sat gray and solid at the back of the garden, dewed over, occupying its space with the absolute permanence of something built by someone who intended it to last. She sat on the bench for a long time. She was not going to take the roses. She had thought about it, had even looked into the logistics of digging and containerizing the rootstock, but she understood that the roses were of this specific soil, this specific drainage and light and 31-year relationship with this particular plot of earth. Taking them would be an act of sentiment, not of genuine care for them. They would struggle in containers, would produce fewer blooms, would spend their energy surviving transition instead of growing. Sometimes the most loving thing you could do for something was to leave it where it had rooted and trust that whoever came next would recognize what they had inherited. She was going to take 3 things. The first was a handful of seeds, from the rose hips she had dried last autumn without knowing exactly why, from the herb bed, from the apple tree's fallen fruit. Seeds were not the garden. They were the garden's capacity. She could carry capacity with her anywhere. The second was a cutting from the lavender border. One strong stem, properly treated, wrapped in damp cloth, small enough to fit in a jar on whatever windowsill she would have next. Lavender was forgiving. Lavender rooted willingly. She had always admired that about it. The third was the small brass plaque Raymond had made for her birthday 14 years ago and screwed to the back of the bench where almost no one would see it unless they sat down and looked carefully. It read, in his careful handwriting rendered in metal, DMC, who made this garden grow. She had the right tools in her bag. She unscrewed it with steady hands, turned it over, polished it briefly on her sleeve, and put it in her pocket. She would carry her name with her. She had spent 40 years learning, the hard way and then the harder way and then finally the only way that actually worked, that the things worth keeping were never the things that could be taken from you. The house could be sold. The project records could be altered. The professional narrative could be rewritten by someone with more power and fewer scruples. The garden would be paved over by people who saw only the asset value of the land beneath it. But the seeds were hers. The capacity to grow things was hers. The knowledge of her own work, carried in her hands and her training and the 40 years of patient craft, was hers in a way that no deed transfer or strategic whispering campaign could permanently revoke. She had proved that. Not for the industry. Not for Victor Harmon's legacy or its correction. For herself, and for the small community of women who had stood in rooms and said true things when the room had been arranged to make true things cost more than most people could afford to spend. She stood up from Raymond's bench for the last time. She put her hand on the worn gray wood for a moment, feeling its solidity, its patient weathered weight, the particular warmth that would hold even in early morning, as though it retains the heat of every hand that ever rested on it. "Thank you," she said quietly. Then she picked up her bag and walked out of the garden and did not look back. She bought a small house on the far side of town with the money Gerald had returned to her. Not large, not impressive. A single-story brick cottage with good light through the south-facing windows and a garden plot that was currently rough grass and possibility. It had a shed where she could store tools. It had a kitchen with a table big enough for two people to sit at and talk honestly. It had a spare room where Patricia could come and stay and where, eventually, if things continued in the cautious, effortful direction they had tentatively begun, Gerald and his wife might come for Sunday lunch and work at earning back the trust that had to be rebuilt from the ground up. She planted the lavender cutting in a pot on the kitchen windowsill the first week. She planted the seeds in the rough grass garden the second week, marking each one with a small labeled stick the way she had always marked new plantings. Organized, careful, patient, giving each thing the conditions it needed, and then trusting the process. She called Constance, and they had a long conversation that wandered from the gala to the landscape of the industry, now versus the industry of 40 years ago, to a plan, still loose and preliminary, to co-write something together. An account of what had happened, and what the professional culture that allowed it had looked like from the inside, for the graduate students and early career designers who deserved to understand the soil they were planting in. She called Irene once a week, on Thursday evenings. They talked about everything, about their careers, about age, about the surprising relief of being past the point where other people's opinions of you cost something you couldn't afford to spend. Irene was funny and sharp, and had strong opinions about perennial planting schemes that Dorothy found genuinely engaging. They were becoming, with the quiet pragmatism of women who knew how rare genuine understanding was, friends. Dorothy received a letter from the Regional Landscape Architecture Association 6 weeks after the gala, formal and official, containing a certified copy of the corrected project attribution records. The Meridian Waterfront Project. The East Side Community Gardens. Her name, in full, in the professional record. Dorothy May Caldwell. She read it at her kitchen table with her morning tea. Then she went to the shed, found a simple frame she'd bought at a second-hand shop, and framed the letter. She hung it on the wall of the spare room. Not in the main room where visitors would see it, not displayed as a trophy or a proof of anything. In the spare room, where she would see it sometimes when she passed by, and remember, and feel the quiet satisfaction of a wrong that had been, even imperfectly, corrected. Beside it, on the same wall, she hung Raymond's brass plaque. DMC, who made this garden grow. 7 months later, Dorothy was on her knees in the new garden when she heard the gate open. She looked up to find a young woman standing at the edge of the grass plot, perhaps 25, with the slightly uncertain energy of someone who has decided to do something and is now processing the reality of having done it. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said. Dorothy sat back on her heels and pulled off one gardening glove. "That's me. My name is Jess Okafor," the young woman said. "I was at the gala. I was writing my thesis on. I was going to write my thesis on Victor Harmon's design legacy. She paused. Carol Bridges gave me the corrected project records like you asked. I've been reading them. I've been reading everything. And I changed my thesis. Dorothy waited. I'm writing it now on attribution practices in mid-century landscape architecture and how documentation culture does, or doesn't protect the contributions of designers who exist outside the dominant power structure. The young woman smiled briefly, a little nervously. It's considerably less straightforward than what I was writing before. But I think it's more true. Dorothy looked at her for a moment. At this 25-year-old woman with her whole difficult, promising career ahead of her, choosing complexity over convenience, choosing to understand the full landscape she was entering rather than the curated version. Come in, Dorothy said. I'll make tea, and you can ask me whatever questions would be useful to your research. Jess Okafor came through the gate and looked around the garden. The rough grass, the labeled seed markers, the small lavender in its pot on the windowsill visible through the kitchen glass. It's a new garden, Dorothy said, following her gaze. Still early. Most of what I planted is still underground. How do you know what will come up? Jess asked. Dorothy looked at the labeled markers, at the turned earth, at everything still waiting beneath the surface with its own particular patience. You don't entirely, she said. You know what you put in and you know the conditions you've given it. The rest is trust. But if you've planted carefully and prepared the ground honestly and given the right things the right season, she looked at Jess. Most of what you planted comes up. In its own time. On its own terms. She held the garden gate open. Come inside, she said again, and there was something in her voice that was neither bitterness nor forced lightness, but the genuine, durable warmth of a woman who has been through the worst of it and come out the other side still capable of making space for someone else's beginning. The gate closed behind them. In the garden, in the turned earth, in the dark beneath the surface where no one could see yet, the seeds Dorothy Caldwell had carried from her old life were doing what seeds do when they have been planted by patient hands in honest ground. They were quietly, steadily becoming. If Dorothy's story found its way into something you have been carrying quietly, if you recognized, in her patience or her preparation or the long years of saying nothing because the cost of speaking seemed too high, then this story was always meant for you. We spend so much of our lives calculating what truth will cost us. And the calculation is not wrong. Truth does cost. Speaking against power costs. Standing in rooms where no one invited you costs in ways that a person who has never had to do it cannot fully understand from the outside. But here is what 40 years of carrying a silent wound also costs. It costs you the mornings when you could have been building instead of enduring. It costs you the professional relationships that never formed because your reputation was a garden someone else had poisoned. It costs you the particular freedom of being known accurately by the people who matter to you. Your children, your neighbors, the young woman writing a thesis who deserves the true version of the landscape she is entering. Dorothy did not speak because the cost of silence dropped to zero. She spoke because the cost of silence had been silently compounding for 40 years, and she finally understood that she had already paid more than she owed. You do not need a public stage to do what Dorothy did. You need the evidence you have already been keeping, in whatever form you have been keeping it. You need the willingness to let the truth be heard by the people who most need to hear it. And you need the understanding, the hard-won, non-negotiable, nobody can give it to you understanding, that your name belongs on your work, that your story belongs in your own voice, that the version of events written by someone who needed you silent is not the final draft. There is no expiration date on accuracy. There is no statute of limitations on saying my name belongs here. It was here once. And I am returning it to where it was always meant to be. Whatever garden you have been tending alone, whatever seeds you have been carrying from a life that was taken or diminished or deliberately obscured by someone who had more power than conscience, this is your permission, if you needed permission, to find the right season for them. Plant them honestly. Prepare the ground carefully. Give the right things the right conditions. And then trust what grows. If this story planted something in you, if it found the part of you that has been waiting a long time to believe that your truth still matters, that your name still belongs on the work of your life, then subscribe now. Because every day, we come here to tell the stories of people who refused to let the wrong version of their lives be the one that lasted. People who planted carefully in difficult ground. People who proved, in the end, that what was meant to grow always finds its season. Welcome to the place where truth does not age. And neither do you.